The Galactic Colosseum hovered above a barren, crater-ridden moon, an enormous structure of interwoven alien metals, glowing circuitry, and ancient stone engravings marking centuries of battle. Inside, the arena pulsed with energy, filled with tens of thousands of spectators from across the galaxy. Towering insectoid warriors, amphibious strategists, and gelatinous scholars filled the stands, their countless eyes and sensory appendages fixated on the spectacle about to unfold. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a cacophony of screeches, guttural growls, and mechanical hums as the Galactic announcer's floating metallic form descended from the ceiling, its glowing core flashing in rhythmic pulses. Next battle. The reigning champion, Xor'Vath the Unyielding of the Dr. Azul Dominion. The crowd erupted in cheers as the enormous warrior stepped forward. He was a sight to behold, nearly 9 feet tall, his muscular form wrapped in shimmering obsidian armor, for powerful arms flexing with effortless dominance. His species, the Dr. Azul, were bred for war, each born with an innate thirst for combat and an instinctive understanding of battle tactics. His deep, rumbling voice sent vibrations through the very structure of the arena. "Bring me an opponent worth my time." The announcer's core pulsed again. And from the backwater world of Earth, the challenger, Takeshi Kuroda. The reaction was immediate: laughter, scoffing, and murmurs of disbelief. The humans had sent warriors before, but they had never won a single match. Compared to the cybernetically enhanced champions, the genetically engineered titans, or the telekinetic prodigies of other species, Earth's fighters had always been painfully ordinary. As Takeshi stepped into the ring, the laughter only grew. He was small, lean and compact, dressed in simple black attire, his face partially obscured by a dark mask. No armor, no visible weaponry, no cybernetic enhancements. He stood still, hands calmly resting at his sides, eyes barely visible beneath the shadow of his hood. Xor'Vath exhaled in disappointment, rolling his massive shoulders. "This is a joke," he muttered, shaking his head. A Dr. Azul spectator from the stands laughed, slamming his fist against the railing. "At least let the human say his final words before you crush him." More laughter rippled through the arena. Takeshi remained silent. He simply bowed, slow, deliberate, precise. The gesture, so simple, so utterly devoid of fear, caused Xor'Vath to hesitate for the briefest of moments. It was not the bow of a desperate man pleading for mercy. It was the bow of a man who already knew the outcome of this fight. Xor'Vath sneered, shaking off the feeling. "You will not be standing long enough to bow again, little human." The gong sounded. The battle had begun. Xor'Vath moved first, his speed unnatural for a creature of his size. He lunged forward, 2 of his massive fists swinging in a bone-shattering arc, aiming to end the fight before it had even begun. But Takeshi was no longer there. His movement wasn't a mere dodge. It was an absence, a flicker of motion so swift that it left an afterimage in the dust. One moment he stood in the path of the strike, and in the next, he was behind Xor'Vath, still standing as if he had never moved at all. The arena fell silent. Xor'Vath narrowed his eyes. He had fought thousands of warriors, creatures capable of warping space, manipulating time, wielding weapons forged from collapsing stars. Yet none had ever moved like this. He twisted on his heel, his other 2 arms swinging toward Takeshi's midsection in a crushing attempt to grab him. Again, Takeshi was gone, his movement fluid, an effortless glide as he sidestepped just enough to let the attack pass by without so much as brushing his clothing. Xor'Vath's frustration boiled. He had never had to chase an opponent before. He pressed forward, his attacks a flurry of strikes, blindingly fast, designed to corner his prey. But each time, Takeshi simply wasn't where the attacks landed. Then, for the first time, Takeshi struck back. A single, precise tap to the back of Xor'Vath's knee. It was nothing. It shouldn't have mattered. Yet, for some reason, his leg wavered for a fraction of a second. The Dr. Azul champion's mind raced. What was this? A trick? A technique? The momentary stagger was subtle, but he felt it, an instability that had never existed before. The crowd, once roaring with laughter, was beginning to grow quiet. Takeshi stood still, his body completely at ease, his posture unshaken. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You rely on your strength. It makes you predictable." Xor'Vath snarled, but there was something foreign in the back of his mind now, something the great warrior had never felt before. Uncertainty. He clenched his fists and charged again. This time, he would not hold back. He would end this, no matter what. Takeshi simply exhaled, his stance shifting slightly. The moment Xor'Vath's attack reached him, he would move, not before, not after. In a battle of brute force, the strongest usually won. But Takeshi Kuroda was not here to fight with strength. He was here to end this fight before it ever truly began. Xor'Vath charged again, his 4 massive fists tearing through the air with the force of a meteor storm. Dust and energy crackled around him, his attacks faster than what the eye could follow. The arena floor shook with each strike, leaving deep craters where his blows landed. The sheer power on display was enough to make lesser beings tremble. But Takeshi Kuroda was not trembling. He was moving, effortlessly, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of reality, like a whisper of wind that refused to be caught. He flowed around Xor'Vath's attacks, his body shifting just enough to let each devastating strike pass him by, missing by inches, yet never more than necessary. He did not block. He did not counter. He simply refused to be hit. The crowd, once roaring with laughter, was now murmuring in confusion. This wasn't how fights went. Battles in the Galactic Colosseum were brutal, exchanges of titanic blows that sent shockwaves rippling through space. Warriors were meant to endure, to strike harder, to prove their dominance through raw strength. But Takeshi wasn't playing by those rules.
Growled in frustration. "Fight back, human," he bellowed, swinging all 4 fists in a crashing downward blow meant to pulverize the ground beneath Takeshi and leave him with nowhere to escape. For a brief moment, it seemed inescapable, until Takeshi moved again. It wasn't a jump. It wasn't a sprint. It was simply a shift in his stance, a precise movement that turned a death trap into nothing. He was behind, once more before the attack had even finished landing. The fist smashed into the ground, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air, but no satisfying crunch of a broken opponent. No cry of pain. Only silence. Span around, eyes burning with fury. "Enough of this," he roared, activating the energy fields woven into his armor. Purple flames burst from his gauntlets, crackling with enough force to vaporize lesser beings. "You will stand and fight." Takeshi simply stood there, watching, studying. Then, in a moment of stillness, he spoke. "You're angry." His voice was calm, almost soothing. "You don't know why, do you?" Hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with a furious snarl, he lunged again, his speed nearly doubled by his activated armor. His fists burned with raw energy, tearing through the air. This time, Takeshi did not evade. He stepped into the attack. Gasps erupted from the crowd. It was suicide. No human could withstand that kind of force. The strike connected, but something was wrong. Instead of Takeshi being sent flying, it was who staggered. A sharp, precise counterforce redirected his momentum, sending him stumbling to the side. It was impossible. He had felt nothing. No impact, no resistance. And yet, somehow, he had lost balance. Takeshi moved again, faster than before. A flicker of motion. A shift of weight. His foot tapped the inside of knee at the exact right moment, and the massive warrior's leg buckled. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Snarled, but before he could recover, Takeshi had already placed himself at an angle where none of the limbs could effectively strike. It was an impossible position, a blind spot that shouldn't exist in a warrior's stance. Yet there he was. Takeshi reached out and tapped, elbow joint with 2 fingers. The warrior roared and swung, but his arm did not move as he intended. For the first time in his life, body was not obeying him. Realization dawned on the audience like a creeping storm. This was no ordinary human. This was not luck. It was skill. Perfect control. Undefeated champion of the Galactic Colosseum, had never fought an opponent like this. Every instinct he had honed over decades of battle, every strategy drilled into his very being, was failing him. And Takeshi was just standing there, calm, unshaken, untouchable. Roared, launching a final, desperate strike, all 4 of his arms moving in perfect synchronization, an attack that had felled titans and warlords alike. It should have been unstoppable. And yet, Takeshi stepped forward. A single movement, smooth as flowing water, and suddenly, he was inside, guard, past all 4 of his deadly arms, standing so close that the massive warrior's own size became a disadvantage. A sharp tap at the base of spine. A controlled redirection of force. The champion's body twisted against his will. And then, silence. Was on his knees. He did not remember falling. He could not comprehend what had just happened. He tried to move, to rise, but he couldn't. His muscles refused. His limbs were frozen, locked in place by subtle shifts in his own momentum, manipulated with perfect precision. Takeshi stood before him, unscathed, not even out of breath. Strength is not dominance, Takeshi said softly. True strength is control. You lost the moment you let your emotions dictate your actions. Panted, his rage fading into something else, something unfamiliar. Was this humility? He had never known defeat. He had never known weakness. And yet, in this moment, he could not deny it. He had been beaten not by brute force, but by mastery beyond his comprehension. The crowd was utterly silent. Thousands upon thousands of beings who had once mocked the human now sat in stunned disbelief. Takeshi turned and began walking away. Still on his knees, clenched his fists. Human, he called out. Takeshi stopped but did not turn. Swallowed his pride. What is your title? Takeshi finally looked back, his expression unreadable. I am called a ninja. The word was foreign to the tongue, yet it carried weight. Meaning, a title not of brute strength, but of absolute skill. Bowed his head. For the first time in his life, he understood.
The Galactic Coliseum had never been so silent. The thousands of alien spectators, who had jeered and laughed at the human before, now sat in stunned disbelief. The fight had not been a fight. It had been a lesson, a demonstration of control so precise it defied everything they understood about combat. Xor'Vath, the undefeated champion, knelt in the center of the arena, his massive form still and motionless, held in place by nothing but the echoes of a battle that had already ended. And in front of him stood the human, Takeshi Kuroda, unscathed, unshaken. Up in the high chambers where the elite of the galactic empires watched, Supreme Chancellor Orzel exhaled, his mandibles clicking in unease. This is unprecedented, he muttered, his voice hushed as if speaking too loudly would somehow shatter the fragile reality of what they had witnessed. Beside him, General Vrex of the Warborn Dominion, a reptilian warlord who had conquered entire star systems, narrowed his eyes. The human did not strike a single blow, he hissed. And yet, Xor'Vath could not land a single hit. How is this possible? In the lower chambers, the commentary panel, composed of various alien tacticians and historians, scrambled to make sense of it. We have records of human combat abilities, a three-eyed scholar from the Vorkari Alliance muttered. They have developed martial techniques that focus on precision, but this goes beyond mere combat. This is something else entirely. Takeshi, however, had no interest in their discussions. He simply turned to leave, his footsteps light and effortless against the arena floor. But just as he reached the edge, a voice echoed through the massive space. Wait, it was Xor'Vath. He had managed to rise, albeit slowly, his massive frame still struggling to comprehend what had happened to him. His four fists clenched and unclenched as if testing whether he still had control of his own body. I have never been bested, Xor'Vath admitted, his voice heavy with something unfamiliar. And never like this. What you did, it was not just strength. It was. He hesitated, searching for the right word. Understanding. Takeshi finally turned, his gaze calm. You fight with power, he said simply. But power without control is wasted motion. You attack with your arms, your fists, your strength. But I do not fight with just my body. I fight with everything. He gestured around them. The space between us. The moment before an attack. Your breathing, your stance, the weight of your feet on the ground. Everything speaks, and I listen. That is why you lost. Xor'Vath processed these words with difficulty. He had spent his life believing in the supremacy of raw strength, in the doctrine that power alone dictated victory. But now, as he stood before a man half his size who had not needed to land a single strike, he realized that everything he had believed was incomplete. Teach me, Xor'Vath said at last, lowering his head in respect. A ripple of shock ran through the Colosseum. A champion, a warrior whose name was spoken across the stars, was bowing to a human? Takeshi tilted his head, considering the request. I cannot teach you everything, he said finally. Some lessons must be learned through experience. But I can give you something to think about. He stepped forward, his movements so fluid that even now, in stillness, it seemed as if he were part of the very air itself. When you strike, do not think of overpowering your opponent. Think of what happens before the strike. Think of where your balance is, where your energy flows. Think of the moment before impact, because that is where the battle is truly decided. Xor'Vath nodded slowly, committing the words to memory, even if he did not yet fully understand them. The crowd, sensing the weight of this moment, remained silent. But in the high chambers, Supreme Chancellor Orzul leaned forward, his mind racing. "We have mocked the humans," he said, almost to himself. "We thought them weak, primitive in comparison to our might. And yet, today, one has humbled our greatest warrior without a single blow." His claws tapped against the armrest of his chair. If they are capable of this, what else do they know? General Vrex remained silent, his reptilian eyes locked onto Takeshi. "They are more dangerous than we thought," he murmured. "Not because of their weapons, not because of their armies, but because of this. Their understanding, their ability to adapt." He exhaled sharply. "This changes everything." Back in the arena, Takeshi turned once more to leave. This time, no one stopped him. He walked with the same quiet confidence he had carried from the beginning, his back straight, his expression calm. He did not revel in his victory. He did not boast. He simply moved forward, as if the fight had never happened at all. And perhaps, in his mind, it hadn't. Xor'Vath watched him go, feeling something unfamiliar stir within him. Not anger, not humiliation, but something closer to respect. He clenched his fists and made a silent vow. He would learn. He would grow. And one day he would meet the human again. As Takeshi stepped beyond the Colosseum doors, the alien night sky stretched before him, filled with unfamiliar stars. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those watching him, those studying him, those who now understood that Earth's warriors were not to be underestimated. Then, without a word, he vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the echo of his presence. And across the galaxy, where once the name of humanity had been spoken with laughter and derision, a new sentiment began to take root. Not fear, not hatred.
The Galactic Council Hall had never been this full. Representatives from every corner of known space had gathered, their holographic emblems flickering in the vast chamber. A tension hung in the air, one that was not born of fear, nor of hostility, but of something rarer, humility. The battle in the Colosseum had been transmitted across thousands of systems, and the impact of what had occurred had rippled outward like a tidal wave. Humanity, once viewed as an amusing afterthought in the grand hierarchy of galactic powers, had demonstrated something that no other species had fully understood. At the center of the room, Xor'Vath, the once undefeated champion of the arena, stood no longer as a warrior but as a messenger. The bruises from his battle with Takeshi Kuroda had long since healed, but the lesson remained etched into his very being. He was no longer the same creature who had once believed in the dominance of brute strength. He had seen another way. And now, he stood before the most powerful leaders of the galaxy, prepared to say what needed to be said. The warlords of the Dominion once believed that power came only from the body, Xor'Vath began, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. We believed that strength alone determined worth, that those who could crush their enemies would always stand at the top. But I was wrong. We were wrong. The murmurs that followed were quiet, but present. Among the gathered delegates, Supreme Chancellor Orzul sat forward, his compound eyes narrowing. "You speak as though the Dominion no longer holds this belief," he said, his voice slow, testing. Xor'Vath turned his head slightly, his golden eyes gleaming. "Because I no longer hold it," he replied. "And there are many others who now question it as well." He took a step forward, allowing his massive presence to fill the space. "Takeshi Kuroda did not defeat me with strength. He did not defeat me with weapons. He defeated me with something far greater. Something that all of us, as a galaxy, have neglected to understand. Control. Strategy. The ability to act without acting. To move without moving. To win without fighting." A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. For centuries, the galactic superpowers had measured their might through fleets, weapons, and the sheer destructive potential of their armies. And yet, this single event, a battle that had lasted mere minutes, had cast doubt upon the very foundation of that thinking. "You believe that humanity is superior?" a delegate from the Tarkesh Confederacy asked, his serpentine body coiling slightly as he spoke. Xor'Vath shook his head. "No. That is not the lesson I have learned. The lesson is that we have been asking the wrong questions. We have spent lifetimes building weapons to destroy one another, but we have not sought to understand what truly makes a warrior. Strength without understanding is weakness. Power without control is chaos. That is what I have learned from humanity. Silence followed. The words were heavy, and they carried weight, for they came not from a politician, not from a scholar, but from a warrior who had lived by the sword and had now been humbled by something greater. At the far end of the chamber, a new voice spoke. It was Takeshi himself, standing unnoticed until now, his presence quiet yet commanding. "You speak well, Xor'Vath," he said, stepping forward with measured grace. He was unarmed, dressed simply, as he had been in the fight, and yet the entire room turned toward him as though he held the power of a fleet. But this is not a lesson for warriors alone. It is a lesson for all of us. He looked around the chamber, his gaze passing over each delegate, as if weighing them in his mind. For too long, this galaxy has believed that power is something to be wielded against others. That strength exists only to dominate. That the strong take and the weak submit. But strength is not about taking. It is about knowing when to act and when not to. True strength is restraint. True power is knowing that you do not have to prove yourself to anyone. A heavy silence followed. Then, Supreme Chancellor Orzul, the highest authority in the Galactic Council, let out a slow breath. "And what do you suggest we do with this knowledge, human?" Takeshi met his gaze without flinching. "That is for you to decide," he said simply. "I am only a man. A fighter. A student of my art. But if one fight, one moment, could change the way a warrior thinks, then perhaps, with time, it can change the way a civilization thinks as well." Xor'Vath turned, his large frame looming beside Takeshi. "He is right," he rumbled. "The old ways must change." Orzul studied the two of them for a long time before finally speaking. "Perhaps," he admitted. "Perhaps they must." The meeting ended with no grand declaration, no sudden shift in power, but something far more important, a seed of change planted in the minds of the galaxy's leaders. As Takeshi stepped away from the chamber, he felt Xor'Vath fall into step beside him. "You still owe me a rematch," the alien warrior muttered. Takeshi smirked. "You still haven't learned your lesson, have you?" Xor'Vath chuckled, a deep and rumbling sound. "I think the lesson is that learning never ends." Takeshi nodded in agreement. "That's the first thing you've said that I actually like." And as the two walked side by side, warriors of different worlds bound not by strength but by understanding, the galaxy itself seemed to shift ever so slightly. Not because of war. Not because of conquest. But because of an idea. And sometimes, an idea was the most dangerous force of all.